Chapter 24 of the extraordinary battle which Don Quixote waged with what he took to be a giant. Don Quixote was still asleep when the dinner was served, and during dinner, the innkeeper, his wife, his daughter, and Maritornes, being there as well as all the travelers, they talked of Don Quixote's strange craze, and of the state in which they had found him. The hostess told them of what had happened between him and the carrier, and glancing round to see if Sancho were present, and not seeing him, she told them the story of his being tossed in the blanket, to the no small entertainment of all the company. The curate told him it was the books of knighthood that Don Quixote had read that had turned his head. "I know not how that can be," said the innkeeper, "for to my thinking there is no finer reading in the world, and when it is harvest time the reapers here often collect during the midday heat, and one who can read takes one of these books in hand, while some 30 of us get round him and sit listening with so much delight that I could find it in my heart to be hearing such stories day and night." "And I think well of them too," said the hostess, "for when the reading is going on, you are so full of it that you forget to scold me, and I have a good time of it." "Ah," said her daughter, "I too listen, and though I like not the fights which please my father, yet the lamentations which the knights make when they are away from their ladies make me weep for pity, and I enjoy that." "We have need here," said the curate, "of our friends, the old woman and the niece. Beware, my good host, of these books, and take care that they carry you not on the road they have taken Don Quixote." "Not so," said the innkeeper. "I shall not be such a fool as to turn knight-errant, for I see well enough that it is not the fashion now to do as they used to do in the times when these famous knights roamed about the world. All that is of no use nowadays." Sancho came in the midst of this, and was amazed to hear them say that knights-errant now were of no use, and that books of knighthood were full of follies and lies. And he made up his mind to see the end of this voyage of his master, and if that did not turn out as happily as he expected, to return home to his wife and children and to his former labors. At this moment a noise came from the room where Don Quixote was lying, and Sancho went hastily to see if his master wanted anything. In a few moments he returned, rushing wildly back and shouting at the top of his voice, "Come, good sirs, quickly, and help my master, who is engaged in one of the most terrible battles my eyes have ever seen. I swear he has given the giant, the enemy of my lady, the princess Micomicona, such a cut that he has sliced his head clean off like a turnip." "What sayest thou, friend?" said the curate. "Art thou in thy wits, Sancho? How can it be as you say, when the giant is at least 2,000 leagues from here?" By this time they heard a marvellous great noise within the chamber, and Don Quixote shouting out, "Hold, thief, scoundrel, rogue! Now I have thee, and thy scimitar shall not avail thee." And it seemed as if he were striking a number of mighty blows on the walls. "Do not stand there listening," cried Sancho, "but go in and part the fray, or aid my master, though I think it will not now be necessary, for doubtless the giant is dead by now, and giving an account of the ill life he led, for I saw his blood was all about the house, and his head cut off, which is as big as a great wine-bag." "May I be hewed in pieces," cried the innkeeper on hearing this, "if Don Quixote has not been slashing at one of the skins of red wine that are standing filled at his bed-head, and the wine that is spilt must be what this fellow takes for blood." So saying, he ran into the room, and the rest followed him, and found Don Quixote in the strangest guise imaginable. He was in his shirt, which did not reach to his knees. His legs were very long and lean, covered with hair, and not over clean. On his head he wore a greasy red nightcap, which belonged to the innkeeper. Round his left arm he had folded the blanket from off his bed, at which Sancho gazed angrily, for he owed that blanket a grudge. In his right hand he gripped his naked sword, with which he laid round about him with many a thwack, shouting out as if indeed he was at battle with some terrible giant. The best sport of all was that his eyes were not open, for he was indeed asleep, and dreaming that he was fighting a giant. for his imagination was so full of the adventures in front of him that he dreamed that he had already arrived at Micomicon, and was there in combat with his enemy. And he had given so many blows to the wine bags, supposing them to be the giant, that the whole chamber flowed with wine. When the innkeeper saw this, he flew into such a rage that he set upon Don Quixote with his clenched fist, and began to pummel him, so that if Cardenio and the curate had not pulled him off, he would have finished the battle of the giant altogether. In spite of this, the poor knight did not awake until the barber got a great kettleful of cold water from the well and threw it right over him, when Don Quixote woke up. But even then, he did not understand where he was. As for Sancho, he went up and down the floor, searching for the giant's head, and seeing he could not find it, said, "Now I know that everything I see in this house is enchanted, for this head is not to be seen here, though I myself saw it cut off with my own eyes, and the blood running from the body, as from a fountain." "What blood or what fountain dost thou cackle of here?" cried the innkeeper. "Thou thief! Dost thou not see that the blood in the fountain is no other thing but the wine bags which are ripped open, and the red wine which swims up and down the room?" "I know nothing but this," replied Sancho, "that if I cannot find the giant's head, my earldom will dissolve like salt cast into water." For indeed, Sancho awake was worse than his master asleep. So greatly had his master's promises turned his brain. The innkeeper was at his wits' end at seeing the stupidity of the squire and the mischief done by his master, but he determined that they should not, as before, go away without paying. That knighthood should be no excuse for this, and he would make them pay for the very patches in the wineskins that had been ruined. All this time the curate was holding Don Quixote's hands, who, believing that he had finished the adventure and was in the presence of the Princess Micomicona herself, fell on his knees before the curate and said, "Your Highness, exalted and beautiful lady, may live from henceforth secure from any danger that this wretched giant might have done to you, and I am also freed this day from the promise I made to you, seeing that I have, with the assistance of her through whose favour I live and breathe, so happily completed my labour." "Did I not say so?" cried Sancho, hearing his master. "I was not drunk. My master has salted the giant down this time, and my earldom is secure." Who could help laughing at the follies of the two, master and man? All of them laughed, except the innkeeper, who burst out into fits of anger 10 times worse than before. At length the barber, Cardenio, and the curate managed, not without much ado, to get Don Quixote to bed again, and presently left him sleeping with every sign of being worn out. They let him sleep, and went out to comfort Sancho Panza, whose grief was great at not finding the giant's head, but they had more to do to pacify the innkeeper, who was almost out of his wits at the sudden death of his wineskins. His wife, too, was running up and down, scolding and crying out, "Alas, the unlucky hour when this knight-errant came to my house! Would that mine eyes had never seen him, for he has cost me dear. The last time he was here, he went away scot-free for his supper, bed, straw, and barley for himself, his man, his horse, and his ass, because he said he was a knight-errant. Then for his sake the other gentlemen came and took away my good tale, and have returned it damaged. And now he breaks my wineskins and spills the wine. I wish I may see as much of his blood spilt." And, backed up by Maritornes, the good innkeeper's wife continued her lamentations with great fury. At length the curate quelled the storm, promising to satisfy them for the wine and the skins, and also for the damage to the tail, about which there was so much fuss. Dorothea comforted Sancho, telling him that as soon as ever it was made certain that his master had slain the giant and placed her safely in her kingdom, she would give him the best earldom she had. With this he was consoled, and told her that he himself had seen the giant's head cut off, and that it had a beard which reached down to his girdle, and that if the beard could not now be found, it was because the affairs of this house were all guided by enchantment, as he knew to his cost by what had happened to himself in his last visit. Dorothea replied that she was of the same opinion, and bade him be of good cheer, since all would be well ended to his heart's desire. Chapter 25, which treats of other rare adventures which happened at the inn. Later in the day, the innkeeper, who was standing at the door, cried out, "Here is a fine troop of guests coming. If they stop here, we may sing and rejoice." "Who are they?" asked Cardenio. "4 men on horseback," answered the innkeeper, "with lances and targets, and all with black masks on their faces. With them comes a woman dressed in white, on a side saddle, and her face also masked, and 2 lackeys that run with them on foot." "Are they near?" asked the curate. "So near," replied the innkeeper, "that they are now arriving." Hearing this, Dorothea veiled her face, and Cardenio went into Don Quixote's room, and they had hardly time to do this when the whole party, of whom the innkeeper had spoken, entered the inn. The 4 who were on horseback were of comely and gallant bearing, and, having dismounted, went to help down the lady on the side saddle, and one of them, taking her in his arms, placed her upon a chair that stood at the door of the room into which Cardenio had entered. All this while neither she nor they took off their masks or said a word. Only the lady, as she sank into the chair, breathed a deep sigh and let fall her arms as one who was sick and faint. The lackeys led away the horses to the stables. The curate, seeing and noting all this, and curious to know who they were that came to the inn in such strange attire and keeping so close a silence, went after one of the lackeys and asked of him what he wanted to learn. "Faith, sir, I cannot tell you who these are, but they seem to be persons of good quality, especially he who went to help the lady dismount. The rest obey him in all things." "And the lady, who is she?" asked the curate. "I cannot tell you that neither," replied the lackey, "for I have not once seen her face during all the journey, though I have often heard her groan and utter deep sighs." "And have you heard the name of any of them?" asked the curate. "Not I, indeed," replied the man. "They travel in silence, and nothing is heard but the sighs and sobs of the poor lady, and it is our firm belief that wherever she is going against her will." "May be it is so," said the curate, and he returned to the inn. Dorothea, who heard the disguised lady sigh so mournfully, moved by pity, drew near to her and asked, "What ails you, good madam? For I offer you my service and good will, and would help you as much as lies in my power." To this the unhappy lady made no reply, and though Dorothea again spoke kindly to her, yet she sat silent and spoke not a word. At length the masked gentleman came across and said to Dorothea, "Lady, do not trouble yourself to offer anything to that woman. She is of a most ungrateful nature, and not wont to return any courtesy." "I have never spoken," said the silent lady, "since I am too unhappy to do so, and am almost drowned in my misfortunes." Cardenio overheard these words very clearly and distinctly, for he was close to her who uttered them, the door of Don Quixote's room being the only thing that separated them, and he cried aloud, "What is this I hear? What voice is this that hath touched mine ear?" The lady, moved with a sudden passion, turned her head at these cries, and as she could not see who uttered them, she rose to her feet, and would have entered the room. But the gentleman stopped her, and would not let her move a step. This sudden movement loosened the mask, which fell from her face, discovering her marvelous beauty. But her countenance was wan and pale, and she turned her eyes from place to place, as one distracted, which caused Dorothea and the rest to behold her with a vast pity. The gentleman held her fast by the shoulders, and was so busied that he could not hold up his own mask, which fell from his face, and, as it did so, Dorothea looked up and discovered that it was her lover, Don Fernando. Scarce had she known him, than breathing out a long and most pitiful "Alas!" from the bottom of her heart, she fell backward in a swoon. And if the barber had not been by good chance at hand, she would have fallen on the ground with all the weight of her body. The curate removed the veil from her face, and cast water thereon, and Don Fernando, as soon as he looked upon her, turned as pale as death. Cardenio, who had heard the moan which Dorothea uttered, as she fell fainting on the floor, came out of the room, and saw Don Fernando, holding his beloved Lucinda. All of them held their peace and beheld one another. Dorothea looking on Don Fernando on Cardenio, Cardenio on Lucinda, and Lucinda on Cardenio. All stood dumb and amazed, as folk that knew not what had befallen them. Lucinda was the first to break the silence. "Leave me, Don Fernando," she cried, "for the sake of what is due to yourself. Let me cleave to the wall whose ivy I am, to his support from whom neither your threats nor your promises could part me." By this time Dorothea had come to herself, and seeing that Don Fernando did not release Lucinda, she arose, and casting herself at his feet, shed a flood of crystal tears as she thus addressed him. "If the sun of Lucinda's beauty hath not blinded thine eyes, know that she who is kneeling at thy feet is the hapless and miserable Dorothea. I am that lowly country girl to whom thou didst promise marriage. Know, my dear lord, that the matchless love I bear thee may make amends for the beauty and nobility of her for whom thou dost abandon me. Thou canst not be the beautiful Lucinda's, because thou art mine, nor she thine, for she belongs to Cardenio. And all this being so, as in truth it is, and seeing that thou art as good as thou art noble, wherefore put off making me once more happy again. Do not vex the declining years of my parents, who have ever been loyal vassals to thine, for remember, whether thou wilt or no, thou must ever remain my promised husband." These and many other reasons did the grieved Dorothea use, with so much feeling and so many tears, that all who were present, even those who had come with Don Fernando, could not help from giving her their sympathy. As for Don Fernando, he stood gazing fixedly at Dorothea for some time, and at last, overwhelmed with remorse and admiration, he took her to his arms, saying, "Thou hast vanquished, O beautiful Dorothea. Thou hast vanquished." At the same moment, Cardenio, who had stood close to Don Fernando, started forward to catch the fainting Lucinda, who threw both her arms around his neck, crying, "Thou, and thou only, art my lord and master." Thus were the true lovers all united, and the good curate, the barber, and even Sancho Panza joined in their tears, delighted that so much joy had taken place of so much misery. As for Sancho, he excused himself afterwards for his tears, saying he wept only because he saw that Dorothea was not the queen of Micomicona, as he had imagined, from whom he hoped to have received such mighty gifts and favors. Each in turn told his or her story, and Don Fernando gave an account of all that had befallen him in the city after he had found the scroll that Lucinda had written, in which she declared her love for Cardenio. And it appeared that, the day after the interruption of the wedding, Lucinda had secretly departed from her father's house, and had fled no one knew whither. But within a few months, Don Fernando had learned that she was in a certain convent, intending to remain there all the days of her life, if she could not pass them with Cardenio. As soon as he had learned that, choosing 3 gentlemen to aid him, he went to the place where she was. One day he surprised her walking with one of the nuns in the cloisters, and carried her off without giving her a chance to resist. From there they brought her to a certain village, where they disguised themselves, and so rode on until they came to the inn. But Lucinda, after she was in his power, did nothing but weep and sigh without speaking a word. Then, in silence and tears, they had reached this inn, which to him and all of them would always remain the most beautiful place in the world, since it had seen the end of so many troubles, and brought him back to his own true love. Chapter 26, wherein is continued the history of the famous Princess Micomicona. Sancho gave ear to what he heard with no small grief of mind, seeing that all hopes of his earldom vanished away like smoke, and the fair Princess Micomicona was turned into Dorothea, whilst his master was sound asleep, careless of all that happened. Dorothea could not believe that the happiness she enjoyed was not a dream. Cardenio and Lucinda were of a similar mind, and Don Fernando was truly thankful that he was free from the dangerous path he had taken, which must have ended in loss of all honor and credit. In a word, all were contented and happy. The curate, like a man of sense, congratulated every one on his good fortune, but she that kept greatest jubilee and joy was the hostess, because Cardenio and the curate had promised to pay all the damages done by Don Quixote. Only Sancho, as has been said, was unhappy and sorrowful, and thus he went with a melancholy face to his master, who was then just awaking, and said, "Your worship, Sir Knight of the Rueful Countenance, may well sleep on as long as you please, without troubling yourself to kill any giant, or restore to the princess her kingdom, for all that is done and finished already." "That I well believe," replied Don Quixote, "for I have had the most monstrous and terrible battle with that giant that ever I had all the days of my life, and yet with one backstroke, swish, I tumbled his head to the ground, and his blood gushed forth, so that streams of it ran along the earth as if it had been water." "As if it had been red wine, your worship might have said," replied Sancho, "for I would have you know, if you do not know already, that the dead giant is no other than a ruined wine-bag, and the blood 26 gallons of red wine." "What sayest thou, madman?" cried Don Quixote. "Art thou in thy right wits?" "Get up, sir," said Sancho, "and you shall see yourself the fine piece of work you have done, and what we have to pay. You shall behold the queen turned into a private lady called Dorothea, with many other things that may well astonish you." "I should marvel at nothing," replied Don Quixote, "for if thou rememberest right, I told thee, the other time that we were here, how all that happened here was done by enchantment, and it would be no wonder if it were the same now." "I should believe it all," replied Sancho, "if my tossing in the blanket had been a thing of that sort, only it was not so, but very real and certain. And I saw the innkeeper, who is here to this day, hold one end of the blanket and toss me up to the sky with very good grace and strength, and as much mirth as muscle. And where it comes to knowing persons, I hold, though I may be a simpleton and a sinner, that there is no enchantment, but only bruising and bad luck." "Well," cried Don Quixote, "time will show. But give me my clothes, for I would see these wonders that thou speakest of for myself." Sancho gave him his clothes, and whilst he was making him ready, the curate told Don Fernando and the rest of Don Quixote's mad pranks, and the plan he had used to get him away from the Brown Mountains, where he imagined he was exiled through the disdain of his lady. The curate told them further that since the good fortune of the Lady Dorothea prevented them carrying out their scheme, they must invent some other way of taking him home to his village. Cardenio offered to continue the adventure and let Lucinda take Dorothea's part. "No," cried Don Fernando, "it shall not be so, for I will have Dorothea herself carry out her plan, and if the good knight's home is not far from here, I shall be very glad to help in his cure." "It is not more than 2 days' journey," said the curate. "Even if it were more," replied Don Fernando, "I should be happy to make the journey in so good a cause." At this moment, Don Quixote sallied out, completely armed with Mambrino's helmet, which had a great hole in it, on his head, his shield on his arm, and leaning on his lance. His grotesque appearance amazed Don Fernando and his companions very much, who wondered at his gaunt face, so withered and yellow, the strangeness of his arms, and his grave manner of proceeding. All stood silent to see what he would do, whilst the knight, casting his eyes on the beautiful Dorothea, with great gravity and calmness, spoke as follows. "I am informed, beautiful lady, by this my squire, that your greatness has come to an end, and your condition is destroyed. For instead of being a queen and a mighty princess, you are now become a private damsel. If this had been done by the special order of that sage magician, the king your father, because he dreaded that I could not give you all necessary help, I say that he does not know half his art, and has never understood the histories of knightly adventures. For if he had read them with the attention that I have, he would have found how many knights of less fame than myself have ended far more desperate adventures than this. For it is no great matter to kill a giant, be he ever so proud, for in truth it is not so many hours since I myself fought with one. But I will be silent, lest they tell me I lie. Time, the detector of all things, will disclose it when we least expect." "Thou foughtest with 2 wine-bags, not with a giant," cried the innkeeper. Don Fernando told him to be silent and not to interrupt Don Quixote, who continued his speech thus. "In fine, I say, high and disinherited lady, do not trouble if your father has made this change in you, for there is no peril so great on earth but my sword shall open a way through it, and by overthrowing your enemy's head to the ground, I shall set your crown on your own head within a few days." Don Quixote said no more, but waited for the princess's answer. She, knowing Don Fernando's wish that she should continue to carry out their plan, answered with a good grace and pleasant manner, saying, "Whosoever informed you, valorous knight of the rueful countenance, that I have altered and transformed my being, hath not told you the truth, for I am the very same today as I was yesterday. True it is that my fortunes have somewhat changed, and given me more than I hoped for, or could wish for. But for all that, I have not ceased to be what I was before, and I still hope to have the aid of your valorous and invincible arm. Therefore, good my lord, restore to my father his honour, and believe him to be both wise and sagacious, for by his magic he has found me a remedy for all my misfortunes. For I believe that had it not been for you, I should never have attained the happiness I now enjoy, and that I speak the truth, these good gentlemen will bear witness. All that is now wanted is that tomorrow morning we set out on our journey. As for the conclusion of the good success I hourly expect, that I leave to the valour of your invincible arm." Thus spoke the witty Dorothea, and Don Quixote, having heard her, turned to Sancho with an air of great indignation, and said, "Now, I say unto thee, Sancho, thou art the veriest little rascal in all Spain. Tell me, thief and vagabond, didst thou not tell me that this princess was turned into a damsel, and that she was called Dorothea, and that the head that I slashed from a giant's shoulders was a wineskin, with 1,000 other follies, that threw me into the greatest confusion I was ever in my life? I vow," he continued, looking up to the heavens and crashing his teeth together, "I vow that I am about to make such a havoc of thee as shall beat some wit into the pates of all the lying squires that shall hereafter ever serve knights-errant in this world." "I pray you have patience, good my lord," answered Sancho, "for it may well befall me to be deceived touching the change of the lady and Princess Micomicona. But in what touches of the giant's head, or at least the cutting of the wine-bags, and that the blood was but red wine, I am not deceived, I swear. For the bags lie wounded there at your own bedhead, and the red wine hath made a lake in your room, and all this you will know when his honour the landlord asks you to pay the damages." "I tell thee, Sancho, thou art a blockhead," said Don Quixote. "Pardon me, we have had enough of it." "Enough indeed," said Don Fernando, "and let me entreat you to say no more of it. Seeing my lady the princess says she will go away tomorrow, as it is too late to depart today, let us agree to spend this evening in pleasant discourse, and tomorrow we will attend the worthy knight Don Quixote, and be eye-witnesses of the valorous feats of arms he shall do in carrying out this adventure." It was now time for supper, and they all sat down at a long table, for there was not a square or round one in the whole house, and they gave the principal inn to Don Quixote, though he did all he could to refuse it. But when he had taken it, he commanded that the lady Micomicona should sit at his elbow, as he was her champion. The others being placed in due order, they all enjoyed a pleasant supper, listening to the wise, strange discourse that Don Quixote held upon his favourite subject of knightly adventures. Chapter 27. Of the strange enchantment of the unfortunate knight. After supper, it appeared that there were not sufficient rooms in the house for all the company, so the ladies retired to the best apartments, whilst the gentlemen sought rest where they could get it with the least discomfort. Sancho Panza found a bed on his ass's harness, where he was soon fast asleep, and Don Quixote, satisfied with his sense of duty by arming himself, mounting Rocinante, and riding round the inn, that he might act as sentinel of this imaginary castle. In a short time all the inn was drowned in a deep silence. Only the innkeeper's daughter and Maritornes were not asleep, but knowing very well Don Quixote's humour, and that he was armed on horseback outside the inn keeping guard, the two agreed to play him some trick, or at least to pass a little time listening to his nonsense. It so happened that there was not any window in all the inn which looked out into the fields, but only a hole in the barn, out of which they were used to throw the straw. To this hole came the two damsels, and saw Don Quixote mounted and leaning on his lance, breathing forth ever and anon such doleful and deep sighs, that it seemed as if each one of them would tear his very soul. They noted besides how he said in a soft and amorous voice, "O my lady Dulcinea of Toboso, the perfection of all beauty, the sum total of discretion, the treasury of grace, the storehouse of virtue, the ideal of all that is worthy, modest, or delightful in all the world. What might thy ladyship be doing at this present? Art thou perhaps thinking of thy captive knight, who most readily exposeth himself to so many dangers for thy sake? Give me tidings of her, O thou moon. Mayhap thou dost now look down upon her pacing some gallery of her sumptuous palace, or leaning against some balcony, thinking what glory she shall give me for my pains, what quiet to my cares, what life to my death, and what reward for my services. And thou, O sun, who art even now busy saddling thy horses to set off betimes and go forth and see my lady, I beseech thee when thou seest her to salute her on my behalf. But take care that thou dost not kiss her on her face, lest thou provokest my jealousy." So far the knight had proceeded, when the innkeeper's daughter began to call him softly to her, saying, "Sir knight, approach a little way, if you please." At this signal, Don Quixote turned his head, and saw by the light of the moon, which shined then very clearly, that they beckoned him from the hole in the barn, which he imagined to be a fair window full of iron bars, gilded in costly fashion with gold, fit for so rich a castle as he imagined that inn to be. In a moment he believed in his strange fancy that the beautiful damsel, daughter of the lord of the castle, conquered by love of him, was come to have speech with him. In this fancy, and because he would not show himself discourteous and ungrateful, he turned Rocinante about and came over to the hole, and then, having beheld the two damsels, he said, "I take pity on you, beautiful lady, that you have fixed your love where it is not possible to find another's in return. Nor must you blame this miserable knight-errant, whom love hath wholly disabled from paying his address to any other than to her who at first sight became the lady of his choice. Pardon me, therefore, good lady, and retire yourself to your room, and be pleased to say no more to me, that I may not appear ungrateful to you. And if, of the love you bear me, you can find me any other way wherein I may serve you, demand it boldly, for I swear to pleasure you in this, even though my task be to bring you a lock of Medusa's hairs, which are all of snakes, or to capture the beams of the sun in a phial of glass." "My lady needs none of those things, Sir Knight," answered Maritornes. "What doth she then want, discreet dame?" asked Don Quixote. "Only one of your fair hands," said Maritornes, "that she may fulfill the desire that brought her to this window with so great danger to herself, that her lord and father knew of it, the least he would do would be to slice off her ear." "He had best beware of what he does," answered Don Quixote, "unless he would make the most disastrous end that ever father made in this world, for having laid violent hands on the delicate limbs of his amorous daughter." Maritornes had no doubt but that Don Quixote would give up his hand, as he was requested, and having made up her mind what she would do, she went down into the stable and fetched out Sancho Panza's ass's halter. With this she returned again as quickly as possible, and came to the hole just as Don Quixote had set his feet upon Rocinante's saddle, that he might the better reach the barred windows at which he thought the lovesick damsel was standing. And as he stretched forth his hand to her, he cried, "Hold, lady, this hand, or, as I may better say, this scourge of evildoers. Hold, I say, this hand, which no other woman ever touched before, not even she herself who holds entire possession of my whole body. Nor do I give it to you to the end that you should kiss it, but that you may behold the strength of the sinews, the knitting of the muscles, the large and swelling veins, whereby you may learn how mighty is the force of that arm to which such a hand is knit." "We shall see that presently," said Maritornes. And then, making a running knot in the halter, she cast it on the wrist of his hand, and coming down from the hole, she tied the other end of the halter very fast to the bolt of the hayloft door. Don Quixote, feeling the roughness of the halter about his wrist, said, "It seems that you rather rasp than clasp my hand, but yet I pray you not to handle it so roughly, seeing it is in no fault for what you suffer from my inclinations. Remember that those who love well do not take so cruel revenge on those who love elsewhere." But nobody gave ear to those words of Don Quixote, for as soon as Maritornes had tied him fast, she and the other, almost bursting with laughter, ran away and left him fastened in such a manner that it was not possible for him to loose himself. He was standing, as has been said, on Rocinante's saddle, with his whole arm thrust within the hole, and fastened to the bolt of the door, and was in great fear that if Rocinante budged never so little on either side, he should fall and hang by the arm. Therefore he durst not make the least movement, though he might have expected, from Rocinante's patience and mild spirit, that if he were allowed, he would stand without stirring for a whole century. In fine, Don Quixote, finding that he was tied up, and that the ladies were gone, began at once to imagine that all this had been done by way of enchantment, as the time before when he and Sancho had suffered such strange adventures. Then he was wroth with himself for his want of judgment and discretion in venturing to enter the castle a second time, seeing that he had come off so badly the first. For it was a maxim with the knights errant that when they had attempted an adventure and had not come well out of it, it was a token that it was not reserved for them, but for some other. Yet for all this, he drew forward his arm to see if he might deliver himself, but he was so well bound that all his efforts proved vain. It is true that he drew his arm cautiously, lest Rocinante should stir, and though he longed to get into the seat of his saddle again, yet he could do no other but stand upright or wrench off his arm. Many times he did wish for the sword of Amadis, against which no enchantment had power. Then he fell to cursing his stars, or again called upon the lady Dulcinea to remember him anew. Now he would call on his good squire Sancho Panza, who, buried in sleep, stretched out upon his pack-saddle, heard him not, and then he called in vain on the sage Urganda to release him. Finally, the morning found him so full of despair and confusion that he roared like a bull, for he had no hope that daylight would bring him any cure, as he fully believed his enchantment would prove everlasting. This belief was strengthened inasmuch as Rocinante had not budged ever so little, and he came to the conclusion that both he and his horse should abide in that state without eating, drinking, or sleeping, until either the evil influences of the stars were past, or some great enchanter had disenchanted him. In this he was deceived, for scarce did day begin to peep than there arrived 4 horsemen at the inn door, with firelocks on their saddle bows, who were officers of the Holy Brotherhood. They called out at the inn door, which was still shut, giving loud knocks, which, being heard by Don Quixote from the place where he stood sentinel, he cried out in a loud and arrogant voice, "Knights or squires, or whatsoever else ye be, you are not to knock any more at the gates of this castle, seeing that at such an hour as this either those who are within are sleeping, or else are not wont to open their fortress until Phoebus hath spread his beams over the earth. Therefore stand back and wait until it be clear day, and then we will see whether it be just or no that they should open their gates unto you." "What castle or fortress is this," cried one of them, "that we should observe these ceremonies? If thou beest the innkeeper, command that the door be opened, for we are travellers that will tarry no longer than to bait our horses and away, for we ride post-haste." "Doth it seem to you, gentlemen," said Don Quixote, "that I look like an innkeeper?" "I know not what thou lookest like," answered the other, "but well I know that thou speakest madly in calling this inn a castle." "It is a castle," replied Don Quixote, "and one of the best in this province, and it hath people in it who have had a sceptre in hand and a crown on their head." "They be some company of strolling players, then," replied the man, laughing, "for no others hold sceptres or wear crowns in such a paltry inn as this is." "Thou knowest but little of the world," answered Don Quixote, "seeing thou art ignorant of the chances that are wont to happen in knight-errantry." The man's companions wearied of this discourse, and turned again to knock with great fury at the door, and this time they not only waked the innkeeper, but also all the guests, and the former arose to demand their pleasure. In the meantime, it happened that one of the horses on which they rode came sniffing round Rocinante, who stood melancholy and sad, with ears down, bearing up his outstretched master. But, being after all an animal of a friendly disposition to his own kind, he could not refrain from turning round to sniff at him who came towards him. Scarce had he moved one step, when Don Quixote's 2 feet, which were close together, slipped, and sliding from the saddle, the knight would have fallen to the ground, had he not remained hanging by the arm. This caused him so much pain that he felt that his wrist was being cut off, or his arm torn away, for he hung so near to the ground that he touched it with the tips of his toes, and this increased his misery, for, feeling the little that was wanted to set his feet wholly on the ground, he struggled all he could to reach it, deceived by the hope that he could indeed touch it if he only stretched himself a little further.